In the heart of a dusty frontier town, where the sun beat down on cracked wooden sidewalks and every voice seemed louder than the last, a man named Samuel Granger found himself swallowed by silence. A rancher with weathered hands and eyes that held the weight of generations, he had traveled miles to speak at the town hall, a place where promises were made and power was held tight in the hands of the few. But when his turn came, his voice was lost in the shuffle. His concerns, ignored as if carried away by the desert wind. He sat down, shoulders heavy, feeling smaller than the dust swirling beneath the street lamps. What Samuel carried was more than grievances about land or water. It was the story of a life built with sweat, sacrifice, and stubborn hope. A story too often overlooked by those wrapped in fine coats and political speeches. Yet that day, as murmurs filled the room and eyes avoided his, something unexpected happened. The governor himself, a man known for his steel gaze and sharp tongue, took a step away from the podium and silently sat beside Samuel. No words were spoken, no speeches made, just quiet companionship in a room that had forgotten the meaning of listening. This moment, seemingly small, almost invisible, held a power few could understand. It was not about fame or favor. It was about recognition, about a leader who chose to break the noise and meet a man where he was, beside him, shoulder to shoulder, in silence. And in that silence, the true weight of Samuel's story found space to breathe. It was a rare kind of justice in a world that often valued loudness over truth. What followed that day was not a parade or grand announcement, but a shift, a ripple that spread beyond the town hall's creaking doors and into the very soul of the community. It was a story of resilience and respect, of voices raised and heard, and of how sometimes the most profound change begins not with thunder, but with the quiet act of sitting beside someone who has been ignored for too long. Now, you will hear the story of Samuel Granger, a rancher overlooked by many, yet seen by one. A story that reminds us all that true leadership is not about standing above the crowd, but about standing with those who carry the heaviest burdens. And in the dusty silence of that hall, something timeless was born. Samuel Granger had been a fixture in the valley for more than 30 years, a man whose hands knew the hard work of taming land that refused to yield. His ranch sprawled across the rolling hills where the grass was both a blessing and a battleground, where water was a treasure harder to find than gold. For years, he watched as decisions made in town favored newcomers and speculators, men who spoke of progress but ignored the toll it took on those who lived from the land. The drought that summer had been the worst in decades. Crops failed, cattle weakened, and the well was running dry. Determined, Samuel gathered his papers and rode into town, dust trailing behind his horse like a ghost of persistence. The town hall was packed that day, voices rising in debate, accusations flying like stray bullets. Samuel waited patiently, listening as other voices drowned out the pleas of those who, like him, begged for water rights and fair laws. When his name was finally called, his voice faltered under the weight of indifference. The mayor glanced past him, councilmen shifted in their seats, and the room buzzed on, as if he were a shadow, not a man. Frustration settled in his chest like a stone, heavy and unyielding. He stepped down, feeling the eyes of the room like daggers, his words swallowed by the noise. But instead of retreating into the silence that had become his refuge, he sat down quietly at the edge of the room. His jaw clenched, hands gripping the chair, as his mind replayed every missed chance, every cracked promise, every dry well. It was then that a presence settled beside him, steady, deliberate. The governor, a man known for his commanding presence and sharp rhetoric, surprised everyone by moving from his podium to sit silently next to Samuel. No fanfare, no grand gestures, just a simple act of being present. The murmurs in the hall quieted as people watched the powerful man choose silence over speech, respect over showmanship. In that shared quiet, Samuel felt seen for the first time that day, not as a nuisance, but as a person carrying the weight of a land and a people desperate to survive. That silence became a bridge between two men from vastly different worlds, the powerful and the forgotten, the speaker and the unheard. It was an unspoken acknowledgement that sometimes, to lead, one must first learn to listen. And in that moment, the dusty town hall held its breath, waiting to see if this small act would ripple out into something greater. After the meeting, the governor didn't return immediately to his office or entourage. Instead, he stayed seated beside Samuel, listening as the rancher spoke softly of the land's hardships. The drought, the dwindling water supply, the threat of losing the ranch that had been in his family for generations. Samuel's voice, once swallowed by the crowd, now carried weight, not from the governor's words, but from the quiet attention they carried. The room seemed to shrink around them, leaving only the two men and the truth that was too long ignored. The governor asked no questions at first, simply absorbing the stories of cracked earth and thirsty cattle. But as the minutes passed, his expression softened, revealing cracks in the armor of political duty. Samuel, in turn, shared memories of his father, teaching him to read the land, the sacrifices made so that future generations might have a chance. He spoke of neighbors forced to leave, of families broken by lack of resources, and of a community on the brink of losing its identity. Outside the walls of the town hall, word spread of the unusual scene. The governor sitting in silence next to the rancher, a gesture unheard of in the cutthroat world of politics. Townsfolk began to gather, some skeptical, others hopeful. Among them were farmers and cowhands, shopkeepers and teachers, all who had felt the sting of neglect. For the first time in years, they whispered of change, not in grand promises, but in the power of being heard. That night, as Samuel rode back to his ranch beneath a sky smeared with stars, he felt a shift, not in the weather, but in the air itself. The silence shared at the town hall had become a spark, a quiet promise that maybe, just maybe, their voices would no longer be drowned out by power and politics. And somewhere deep inside, he dared to hope that the land, so often forgotten, might finally have a champion. Meanwhile, in the governor's mansion, plans were quietly being laid, not speeches but actions. Water rights re-examined, aid promised to struggling ranchers, a commitment to walk beside those who had long been left behind. Because sometimes, leadership isn't about standing above. It's about sitting beside, listening, and letting the quiet strength of one man's story become the foundation for a new chapter in the West. The following weeks were a whirlwind for Samuel Granger. Invitations arrived from the governor's office, not for speeches or ceremonies, but for discussions. Men and women from distant parts of the territory gathered in small rooms with maps spread across tables, listening to ranchers, farmers, and townsfolk alike. Samuel found himself speaking more than he ever had, his weathered voice carrying the stories of dry wells and shrinking herds. The governor sat quietly at the edge of these meetings, absorbing every word, his presence a steady anchor that told Samuel his message mattered. Back at the ranch, life had not grown easier. The drought still held its grip, and the land, stubborn as ever, demanded more than promises. Yet, Samuel felt a renewed strength, one born not just of hope, but of solidarity. The community, once fractured by fear and neglect, began to come together. Neighbors shared resources, helped repair fences, and worked long hours side by side. For the first time in a long time, the air was thick not just with dust, but with determination. Word of the town hall meetings spread slowly but surely, bringing new faces and fresh ideas to the valley. Engineers arrived with blueprints for irrigation systems. Officials promised funds for wells and reservoirs. The governor made rare visits to the land, walking the dry creek beds alongside Samuel, witnessing firsthand the scars left by years of hardship. In those moments, Samuel saw something unexpected, a leader not distant and cold, but human, someone willing to feel the pain of the land as deeply as those who worked it. At night, Samuel sat on his porch watching the stars, a quiet smile playing at his lips. The governor's silent gesture had sparked a movement, a chain reaction born from an act so simple, so profound, sitting beside a man who had been ignored for too long. It reminded Samuel that change didn't always roar. Sometimes it breathed, slowly, steadily, like the land waiting patiently for rain. And as the seasons began to shift, with clouds gathering on the horizon and promise in the air, Samuel understood the truth he had always known but rarely spoken aloud. It was not power and titles or voices that changed the West. It was the courage to be present, to listen, and to stand quietly alongside those who carry the land's deepest burdens. Together, they would face the drought, the dust, and the future, side by side. The community's renewed spirit was tested that summer when the rains finally came, but not without cost. Torrents poured over the hills, flooding the lowlands and washing away fences, crops, and years of painstaking work. The river swelled, threatening homes and livestock. Samuel's ranch, though battered, stood firm, a testament to resilience built over generations. But the storm reminded them all that survival wasn't guaranteed. It was a battle fought every day, with grit, faith, and the unyielding bond of neighbors. In the aftermath, the governor returned, not with speeches, but with hands ready to help. He rolled up his sleeves alongside farmers, carried supplies, and stayed late into the night, listening to stories of loss and hope. Samuel watched him, not as a distant figure of authority, but as a man who had chosen to be part of the struggle. The silence they had shared in the town hall had become a foundation for trust, respect, and partnership. Together, they organized relief efforts, repaired infrastructure, and laid plans for a future less at the mercy of drought and disaster. The town hall, once a place where Samuel's voice was ignored, became a hub of collaboration. The governor's chair, once a symbol of distance, now sat filled by a man who understood the weight of the land and the people who worked it. And Samuel, once a solitary rancher, found himself woven into the fabric of a community reborn. Years later, when stories were told around campfires and in quiet corners of dusty saloons, the tale of the rancher and the governor was remembered not for conflict, but for connection. How one man's quiet strength and another's willingness to listen had changed the course of a town. How the West, still wild and unforgiving, had shown its gentlest face through an act as simple as sitting beside someone who had long been forgotten. And as the sun set behind the hills, casting long shadows over the valley, Samuel sat on his porch once more, older, quieter, but no longer alone. The droughts, the dust storms, the battles hadn't ended, but they no longer defined him. Because that day in the town hall, a bridge was built, not with words, not with power, but with silence. And sometimes, silence says more than 1,000 speeches ever could. The years that followed brought their own challenges. Fires that scorched the grasslands, harsh winters that tested the mettle of every man, woman, and child who called the valley home. Yet, through it all, the bond forged in that quiet moment between Samuel and the governor endured. The community, once fragmented and worn, had found a new strength in unity and understanding. They met storms not as isolated souls, but as a collective heartbeat pushing back against the relentless wilderness. Samuel became more than a rancher. He was a leader born not from titles, but from respect. His voice, once drowned in the clamor of politics, now carried weight not because of grandeur, but because it was grounded in experience and tempered by humility. He taught younger men and women to read the land's subtle whispers, the changing color of grass, the shifting patterns of clouds, the quiet arrival of water in hidden springs. And with every lesson, he passed on a legacy built not just on survival, but on reverence for the earth and each other. The governor continued to visit, not as a distant official, but as a man who walked beside those he served. Together, they championed policies that prioritized the needs of the land and its people, ensuring that future generations might inherit more than just hardship. The town hall meetings became gatherings of hope, where voices from all walks of life blended into a chorus of determination. And in those moments, Samuel often caught the governor's eye, a silent nod shared between two men who knew that real leadership was about listening as much as speaking. At night, when the stars stretched like a blanket over the valley, Samuel would sit on his porch, the wind carrying stories from distant horizons. He'd think back to that day in the town hall, the sting of being ignored, the shock of a powerful man choosing silence over applause. It was a moment that had changed everything, proving that sometimes the loudest statement is made without words, and that true strength lies in presence. And so, the legacy of Samuel Granger and the governor lived on, not in monuments or history books, but in the land itself, in the faces of those who till its soil, and in the quiet power of a community that learned to stand together. Because in the Old West, where survival was often a lonely fight, it was connection, the simple act of sitting beside another, that became the greatest act of courage. Change came slow to the valley, like the creeping of spring after a brutal winter. But it came, steady and sure, carried by the efforts of many who refused to be silenced. Water once scarce began to flow more freely through newly dug channels. The herds grew stronger, fed by grass that bloomed with the promise of life. And the town itself, once a place where voices clashed and hopes faded, began to hum with the quiet rhythm of progress and respect. Samuel's ranch thrived, not just because of the rain or the soil, but because of the people who had learned to listen and care. Neighbors who had once stood divided now shared tools, labor, and stories beneath wide skies. Children grew up knowing the names of men and women who fought for more than land. They fought for dignity. And the town hall, once a chamber of cold indifference, became a gathering place where every voice, no matter how humble, found its place. The governor, ever mindful of the journey that had begun with silent companionship, continued to champion those whose stories were too often overlooked. He spoke less of power and more of responsibility, of how true leadership meant carrying the burdens of the land and its people with care and humility. And Samuel, his voice steady and sure, became a symbol of that responsibility fulfilled, a reminder that even the quietest men can hold the loudest truths. In the twilight of his years, Samuel often walked the fences, hands resting on weathered posts, eyes tracing the horizon where sky met earth. He saw the changes etched in every field, every stream, every face. And he knew that the silence shared that day in the town hall had become a foundation strong enough to carry generations. A testament to the power of listening, presence, and the courage to stand beside those who had been ignored for far too long. And so, as the sun set over the valley, casting long shadows across the land he loved, Samuel Granger sat once more, no longer invisible, no longer unheard, but a man whose quiet strength had changed the course of a community. Because sometimes, the greatest revolutions begin not with words shouted from a stage, but with a simple act of sitting down and listening. The transformation of the town and its people did not go unnoticed beyond the valley. Word spread slowly, carried by travelers and traders, about the place where a rancher's quiet strength had sparked a change in the highest office. Others in neighboring towns, long accustomed to being overlooked, found hope in Samuel's story. Hope that even the smallest voices could be heard if met with respect and presence. It inspired meetings in dusty halls, whispered plans around campfires, and the slow building of alliances among communities that once felt isolated and forgotten. Back at Hollow Bend, Samuel and the governor shared a bond forged in moments of silence and the shared burden of leadership. Their relationship became a symbol of what the West could be, a place where power was wielded with empathy, where leaders walked among their people instead of above them. Together, they worked to build infrastructure, improve education, and safeguard the land's resources, weaving a future that honored the past but refused to be trapped by it. One afternoon, as the governor prepared to leave after a long visit, Samuel stood beside him on the porch, watching the dust rise from the departing horses. The governor turned and clasped Samuel's shoulder firmly. "You taught me more than I could ever say," he said quietly. "Not through words, but through your strength to be present." Samuel nodded, feeling the weight of those words settle deep in his chest. In that moment, they both understood that true leadership is a shared journey, one marked by listening as much as leading. As years passed, the legacy of their partnership rippled outward, touching countless lives. Children born into the valley grew up with stories not just of hardship, but of hope and resilience. They learned that power could be gentle, that silence could hold meaning, and that even the quietest voice could change the world when met with true listening. The land flourished, and so did the people, tied together by a shared respect born from a moment of simple, profound companionship. And through it all, Samuel remained a humble man, his hands still rough from the earth, his gaze steady, his heart open. He knew the battles were far from over, but he also knew they would never have to face them alone again. For in that silent act beside him at the town hall, a movement had begun. A movement that would carry the spirit of the West forward, one quiet, powerful moment at a time. The seasons turned again, and with them came new challenges and new triumphs. Samuel found himself mentoring young ranchers, sharing the lessons etched by hardship and hope. The community grew stronger, not just in numbers but in spirit, united by the knowledge that their voices mattered, that their stories were woven into the fabric of the land itself. Together, they celebrated harvests and weathered storms, bound by a legacy rooted in respect and resilience. At the heart of the valley, the town hall stood as a testament, not just to politics, but to transformation. It was no longer a place where men like Samuel were ignored, but a space where every citizen, regardless of station, had a seat and a voice. The governor's chair remained at the front, but it was no longer a symbol of distance. It was a reminder of a day a leader chose silence over speech, presence over pretense, and changed the course of a community forever. One evening, as twilight draped the hills in shades of amber and purple, Samuel stood alone on the porch of his ranch, looking out over fields that had been dry for too long, but now sang with life. He felt the weight of years pressing gently on his shoulders, not as a burden, but as a mantle. The silence that had once felt like exclusion now felt like a sacred space, a place where stories were heard, where hope took root, and where the future was quietly, steadily built. He thought back to that day in the town hall, the moment the governor sat beside him, the unspoken solidarity that bridged worlds. It was a reminder that leadership, at its core, is about connection, about seeing the person beside you, hearing the story they carry, and standing with them not just in words, but in presence. In a land as wild and unpredictable as the West, that connection was the strongest foundation of all. And as the stars began to pierce the velvet night, Samuel whispered a quiet promise to the land he loved. A promise to keep listening, to keep standing beside those who need a voice, and to honor the power of silence that spoke louder than any speech. Because sometimes the greatest change begins not with noise, but with the courage to simply be there. Time wove its steady thread through the valley, carrying with it changes as inevitable as the seasons. Samuel Granger's hair had grayed, his back bent slightly with age, but his eyes retained the same fierce spark of determination that had driven him to the town hall years ago. He became a living bridge between the past and the future, his presence a constant reminder that progress was not just measured in laws passed or water channels dug, but in the faces of the people who woke each day to tend the land, their hopes tied to every sunrise. The community flourished under the shadow of that quiet revolution. New families arrived, drawn by the promise of fairness and respect that Samuel and the governor had nurtured. The schoolhouse echoed with children's laughter, farms sprouted green against the arid earth, and the once tense town hall meetings evolved into forums of collaboration and shared vision. Here, every voice was valued, every concern heard, and every success celebrated, not as individual triumph, but as collective gain. Despite his growing renown, Samuel remained humble. He preferred the company of the land and his neighbors to the grandeur of politics. On clear evenings, he could be found sitting on the porch of his ranch, watching the sun dip behind the hills, listening to the whisper of the wind through the grasses. These moments of quiet reflection reminded him that true leadership was a series of small, consistent acts, listening when it was easier to speak, standing still when the world urged haste, and opening doors when others shut them tight. One such evening, the governor returned, not as a man of authority, but as a friend. They sat together in silence, the years of struggle and triumph hanging between them like the fading light. No words were needed. Their shared journey was spoken in the steady rhythm of companionship and mutual respect. And as stars began to bloom in the night sky, they both understood that the legacy they built was more than political change. It was a testament to the power of empathy and the courage to stand beside those who have long been ignored. And so, the story of the rancher and the governor passed into the fabric of the West, not as a tale of heroism shouted from rooftops, but as a quiet legend whispered among the wind-blown grass. A reminder that sometimes the most profound revolutions are not fought with guns or grand speeches, but with the simple act of sitting down, listening deeply, and standing together in silent solidarity. As the years unfolded, the valley became a beacon for those who believed in the power of unity and respect. Stories of Samuel Granger's perseverance and the governor's humility inspired other towns to follow their example, planting seeds of change across the rugged landscape. The West, once marked by division and hardship, began to hum with a new song, one of cooperation, compassion, and hope. Samuel's legacy was not carved into stone monuments or immortalized in grand statues. Instead, it lived in the quiet strength of every farmer who worked the land with pride, every teacher who lifted a child's dreams, and every community member who chose to listen and support one another. His story became a guiding light, a reminder that leadership is not about standing above the crowd, but walking beside those who carry the heaviest burdens. In the twilight of his life, Samuel often reflected on that fateful day at the town hall, the moment the governor sat beside him in silence. It was a turning point that changed not only his life, but the destiny of an entire region. That simple gesture of presence over power became a symbol of what the West could be, a place where every voice matters, where listening leads to action, and where even the quietest among us can spark lasting change. As the sun set on the valley, casting golden hues across the hills, Samuel sat on his porch one last time, feeling the pulse of the land beneath him. He knew that the battles would continue, and new challenges would rise like dust storms on the horizon. But he also knew that the spirit of that silent solidarity would endure, carried forward by generations who understood that sometimes the greatest revolution begins with a single act of compassion. And so, beneath the vast sky of the West, the story closes not with an end, but with a beginning whispered softly in the wind, waiting for the next voice brave enough to be heard and the next hand willing to sit beside a stranger in silence. The story of Samuel Granger and the governor is a testament to the power of presence, the kind of presence that transcends titles, speeches, and political theater. It reminds us that true leadership is not measured by the volume of one's voice, but by the courage to listen deeply and stand beside those who have been silenced for too long. In the dusty heart of the Old West, a simple act of sitting in silence became a catalyst for change, breathing life into a community that had nearly been forgotten. Throughout this journey, we see that the greatest strength lies in connection. It is found not in wielding power over others, but in sharing their burdens. Samuel's story teaches us that when we open our hearts to listen, to truly hear the stories of others, we lay the foundation for transformation. This is a lesson that echoes far beyond the borders of a frontier town, reaching into our own lives and communities, challenging us to stand in solidarity with those who need it most. As the sun sets over the hills and the winds carry the whispers of those who came before, we are reminded that change often begins quietly. It starts with one person choosing to be present, one hand extended in understanding, and one moment of silent respect that speaks louder than any words ever could. In embracing this, we honor not just the legacy of the West, but the enduring spirit of humanity itself. If this story touched something inside you, if it sparked a thought, a feeling, or a hope, then carry it forward. Let it inspire the way you listen, the way you lead, and the way you stand beside others. Because every voice matters, and every moment of genuine presence has the power to change a life, a community, and maybe even the world. If you believe in the strength of stories like Samuel's, join us by subscribing to the channel to explore more tales of courage and connection. Share your thoughts in the comments. Your voice adds depth to this ongoing conversation. And if this video moved you, a simple like helps others find it, allowing the ripple of hope to grow wider. Together, we can build a legacy of presence, compassion, and change, one story at a time.